Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our webinar tonight. My name is Tamsin Medlekamp, and I'm a journalist with Daily Maverick's Maverick Citizen team. And this is actually my first time hosting a webinar for Daily Maverick, so I am incredibly excited, and even more so knowing that we will be tackling this particular topic with the speakers we have with us this evening. Joining us tonight, we have Cape Town Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis, who's been heading up our local government since 2021, when he became the youngest executive mayor we've ever had. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you very, very much. Good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation, and good evening to Nick and Nkosikona.
Yes, joining us as well, Nkosikona Swapboy, who is a well-known land and housing rights activist here in Cape Town, and one of the founder members of Reclaim the City, which is a housing activist organization. Welcome, Nkosikona. And last but most certainly not least, we have Nick Budlander, who is an urban policy researcher with Ndifuna Akwazi, which is another well-known activist organization and law center for housing and land rights here in Cape Town. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks, Tamsin, and good evening, Nkosikona. Good evening, Jordan.
So the topic we'll be tackling here this evening is Anatomy of a Crisis, tackling housing and homelessness in Cape Town. And these issues of housing and homelessness have been at the forefront of discourse in the city for a long time. What we've seen in recent years is the COVID-19 pandemic, which was an economic shock that many thousands of people are still recovering from. And we've seen this continued trend of people gravitating towards urban centers in search of work and opportunities. And what's become abundantly clear is that the pressures we're seeing on our housing and social support systems here in the city aren't going away. They are, in fact, increasing. And so it becomes very important for us to have these conversations where we talk about what's working and what isn't working when it comes to addressing these issues. Now, homelessness is widely regarded as a symptom of deeper issues, things like poverty, inequality, health and mental health issues, etc. And I'd love to delve into every one of those this evening, but given our limited time, we're going to be focusing primarily on the intersection between housing and homelessness. And the estimates we have for how many people are living on the street in Cape Town aren't exact. It ranges from maybe about 7,000 in our most recent census to a report that drew data from 2019-2020 that put the number at just over 14,000 people living on the street. And in that same report, it was estimated that we were spending, as local government, civil society, individuals, about 744 million rand each year addressing homelessness. Of that money spent, this report estimated that about 45% was going towards reactive or punitive measures for homelessness, things like urban waste management, evictions and associated legal costs, law enforcement costs, that kind of thing. And about 16% was going towards developmental costs, things like shelters and support programs and rehabilitation programs and such. And what it concluded was that punitive and even humanitarian methods like donating money have limited effectiveness, as they're not necessarily addressing the underlying issues for homelessness. Long-term strategies tend to center more things like holistic economic empowerment programs and an increase in affordable housing close to urban centers in the city. And at this point, I'm going to draw you in, Mr. Mayor, and look at a recent development here in our city. As many people know, we've had the eviction of unhoused persons from 7 sites around Cape Town's inner city that started last week and continued into this week. And I think that can sort of almost be seen as a combination of punitive and developmental measures, in that these people were being moved out of these sites, but just over 150 were offered spaces at the city's safe space shelters, which have certain rehabilitative programs. Just from the city's side, when it's budgeting for addressing homelessness, how much money is going towards more punitive measures like legal costs with evictions and law enforcement costs and confiscations of belongings and all that, versus how much is going towards the more developmental approach to homelessness with shelters and programs for empowerment and such? And is there any plan to shift how the city spends money on this issue in the next few years?
Thank you very much, Tamsin. The city overwhelmingly prioritizes the what you call the developmental spending, the care interventions. The city is spending 253 million rand over 3 years. That's a quarter of a billion rand on our safe space program. That's not just the accommodation, the physical structure, but all of the programs that get run there, the social work programs, the training programs, the healthcare provision, and so on. So that far outstrips the what we spend on our law enforcement branch, for example, called our DPU branch, our Displaced People's Unit. That is very small. That has a handful of officers that deals with homelessness and its implications, consequences on the street. Obviously, there are other costs as well, like you mentioned, waste collection and cleaning. That is a huge cost as it comes to homelessness, because there's an enormous amount of waste generated on the street, rubbish and human waste and so on, that has to get cleaned up very regularly, and that entails a big cost. But I can very, very confidently say that our spend on those care interventions, the full suite of care packages that we offer, is outstrips that many times over. I cannot think of any other place in South Africa that's spending a quarter of a billion rand on safe spaces and all of the developmental and social assistance programs that get offered there, which are really quite extraordinary, and I think we can be very proud of those. So no, I think the spend on safe spaces and those programs have increased dramatically over the last 2 years, up to that high water mark now of 253 million. We're still looking for a couple of sites for more, so that spend might increase even further. There's been some publicity around a new one in Muizenberg, which we're going to proceed with. We're looking for a site elsewhere in the southern suburbs, probably around Tokai. We're still looking for a site in the north of the city, somewhere around Parklands. So that spend will grow even further. And then just to say, every single person affected by the eviction is offered the alternative. So it's not just the 150 who have accepted it, but all of those who are affected by the eviction are offered the safe space placement and all of the support that comes with that. It's just that only 150 have chosen to accept that, and only after an 18-month court process, which is very, very expensive for the city and ultimately for the public. The end result is that the same offer that was on the table right at the beginning of the safe space accommodation is eventually accepted with some really minor tweaks. So I hope that the precedent has now been established, that we are offering really dignified alternative accommodation and a full package of support, and that we won't see that as dogged and unnecessary opposition in future to those cases, so that we can save a lot of time and money. Thanks.
Thanks, Jordan. I know you've spoken quite a lot about the importance of freeing up these public spaces and the combined motive of getting people off the street, but also getting people out of certain public spaces. And you mentioned hopefully less opposition going forward, which seems like a good time to bring you in, Nick, as a representative of Ndufuna Kwazi. There is a history. Ndufuna Kwazi has been involved in a number of cases over the years where it's either defended people who were going to be evicted from public spaces, buildings, etc., or challenge certain city bylaws that it says criminalize homelessness. So maybe you could bring in the other perspective of why you believe it's important to challenge these evictions in certain cases, and what kind of problems Ndufuna Kwazi has identified with certain bylaws and certain processes for evicting unhoused persons in these environments.
Thank you, Tamsin. So, I think at the outset, it's very important to say that from the perspective of Ndufuna Kwazi, there really has been considerable improvement in the city's approach to homelessness. I think when I first started doing this work about 8 years ago, the most common approach was for Metro Police and private security officers to round up people experiencing homelessness and drop them off on the outskirts of the city with their belongings. And, I think as Jordan has just outlined, that's no longer the kind of thinking and practice that the city is primarily pursuing. I think it's also worth acknowledging that homelessness is an incredibly complex issue, and that it will require a set of sort of graded interventions, backed up by significant social support, to move people up the housing ladder and into a more sort of stable situation. Experts that work on homelessness argue that we need a sort of continuum, moving from safe spaces with very low barriers to entry into, some sort of more stable residential housing, and then finally into permanent housing. And of course, all of this would have to be accompanied by developmental support. And, in terms of your question about laws that we've challenged, the one that we've challenged was the streets bylaw, which made it a crime to beg, stand, sit, or lie in a public place. And in essence, if you if you didn't have shelter, or if you didn't have a home, you were treated as a criminal. I think, and this is despite the fact that many people end up on the streets because of circumstances that are way beyond their control. And also despite the fact that the vast majority of Cape Town households cannot afford to access a formal home. 75% of Cape Town households earn too little to access even the cheapest home on the market. So, I think during this period, the city was regularly fining people experiencing homelessness, and if they couldn't pay the fines, they'd be arrested. And, I barely have to describe what a sort of counterproductive and cruel approach that is in terms of actually sustainably addressing this issue, especially because the number of homeless people far outnumbered the amount of shelter space available. And again, thankfully, we've seen a really significant shift in approach. And while I still believe that there is room for improvement, I think a range of organizations need credit for pushing the city's thinking and practice further. And the city itself needs credit for taking on a lot of these kind of suggestions and a lot of these changes. The other thing I also want to do is I just think it's important to distinguish between occupying a shared public space and occupying a vacant, underutilized property. Like I said, according to the city itself, the vast majority of people cannot afford formal housing. And because people can't access housing through the state or the private sector, they often have no option but to occupy land. I think, in the past, the mayor has said that people who occupy well-located buildings, for instance, are jumping the queue ahead of people that are patiently waiting in informal settlements. But to my mind, that doesn't make any sense, because those informal settlements themselves are occupations. They weren't set up or condoned by the state, but now the government has slowly realized that they need to support people where they are. So really what we need is a very pragmatic approach that kind of grapples with these systemic failures. And, of course, from the city's perspective, occupations make it difficult to manage and administer land. And that is a serious challenge that, that I'll acknowledge for sure. But, they are a major feature of our housing system and our urban form. And I don't see that changing anytime soon because of how few people can access stable housing. And, of course, while there certainly are some bad elements, the vast majority of people that occupy land are just decent, hardworking families that don't have any other option. So instead of kind of viewing occupations as everyone in an occupation as a criminal, we need something a little bit more pragmatic. And that's been a key kind of point in our advocacy. And then finally, the last thing I want to say on this is that if we want to address homelessness at its root cause, then we need to build as much affordable housing in well-located areas as we possibly can to ensure that the wealth and benefits of our city are more evenly distributed. I think research, and I'll speak more about this later, tons of research has shown that Cape Town's dysfunctional and unequal urban form is a major barrier to productivity and to growth and to upward economic mobility. And I think until we really start grappling with these root causes, then we'll continue to see the symptoms. And again, I think the city deserves some credit there. We'll talk more about that later. But, that's kind of the position that we've taken, that the city needs to be pushed further, and they have been pushed further, which, in many ways is great to see. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. It's interesting that you mentioned. Oh, yes.
I see the questions flying in by the dozen here. Do you want?
I do have. I'm gonna
deal with those questions, or you're going to deal with them later.
So I'm gonna quickly ask Nkosi, and I would like to bring him into the conversation, and then we'll take a question from the audience and bring that in as well. I can also see them in my peripheral vision streaming past. Nkosi, Nick mentioned sort of the element of occupied buildings and occupied spaces that are not commonly used public spaces. And we've also been talking about sort of all these issues of budgets and bylaws, but the reality is there are very real human stories behind people who occupy space either on the street or in vacant buildings or everywhere. And you were very recently the subject of a documentary, Mother City, where you brought quite a personal story of how spatial injustice in the city impacts people to the screen. And for our audience, if you get the opportunity to watch this documentary, I highly, highly recommend it. It's very impactful and very hard-hitting. But having that insight and having that experience as a Reclaim the City activist of occupying space and of, coordinating those kinds of things, what are some of the harmful misconceptions and assumptions you've identified with how people treat lower income individuals within certain communities, whether that's people living on the street, people occupying space, people living in shelters, and what kind of harms can those assumptions really do in this situation?
Thank you very much, Tamsin, and good evening to the listeners and also to the fellow panelists. I have to start by saying, the Mother City documentary will be screened on the 31st or 30th of this month at Grand West. And there'll also be more opportunities to see the documentary, which actually highlights or follows activists that have been, including myself, that have been advocating for affordable social housing in the inner city of Cape Town as one of the remedies of undoing the legacy of apartheid spatial planning. I have to say that we have invited the mayor for the 31st, and in the opening night of the documentary, the mayor had an engagement he had to go to and attend, and couldn't watch the documentary, and we're still inviting him to please find time in his busy schedule to go and watch on the 31st, or whether or on the we've sent invites, about 2 invitations to his email, and hoping to get a response in terms of his availability and when he'll be able to attend it. I have to also say that we need to say thank you we need to welcome the fact that the language of the city of Cape Town has changed. When we started Reclaim the City in 2016, under the mayorship of Patricia de Lille, who was the then mayor, the governing party in the Western Cape, in Cape Town in particular, was against the idea of affordable social housing in the inner city of Cape Town. For months, we've had to fight the battle of semantics or the languaging in terms of whether affordable housing is feasible or not in the inner city of Cape Town. And moving on to Den Plateau, and seeing some changes there with Brett Herron leaving the city council after announcing the 12 sites which were for affordable housing in the inner city of Cape Town. Mayor Jordan Lewis took office, and in his first speech at the city council, he made pronouncements on some more pieces of land that will be used for affordable housing. And we welcome that change and that shift in terms of the mentality within the city of Cape Town. We now know that the language of affordable housing in the inner city of Cape Town is one that's fashionable within the city of Cape Town. Every mayor now speaks to that, from Den Plateau to now Mayor Jordan Lewis making his first speech where in 2021 around fulfilling the mandate that the city of Cape Town has in relation to undoing the legacy of apartheid by building social affordable housing in the inner city of Cape Town. And that is a direct result of the work done by Reclaim the City, a movement advocating for affordable housing in the inner city of Cape Town, as well as Ndifuna Ukwazi, which has been the supporting organization that speaks to land and housing issues in Cape Town. And I think that acknowledgement is important, because without the work of those organizations, I doubt that we would be where we are today in terms of discussing the undoing of legacy of apartheid, particularly by building affordable housing in the inner city of Cape Town. However, it's been 30 years, and 15 of those 30 years in Cape Town have been governed by Mayor Jordan Lewis's party. And till this day, there hasn't been any unit of affordable housing built in the inner city of Cape Town. Since the dawn of democracy, we haven't seen any public housing in the inner city of Cape Town. The surrounds, we are starting to see in places like Salt River and so on, where there are, some housing developments being built, but all the pipeline projects for the inner city of Cape Town remain to be pipelines. And I think we do need to remind Mayor Jordan Lewis that a plan with no budget and a timeline is actually another political speech, which will get us to the next 30 years with no affordable housing or no tangible housing that we can point out to. I would love for the mayor to maybe speak to the timelines and the budget allocations of the pipeline projects that he has made pronouncements on when he took office in 2021. It's been 3 years now. We have not seen any budget. We have not seen any tangible timeline to say this is when the project that Jordan Lewis, made a pronouncement on will actually be built. Without that, we can't trust politicians, as we've seen in the past 30 years. The ANC government, which governed the Western Cape and Cape Town for 15 years, made promises. The same thing that we're seeing now with Mayor Jordan Lewis's party in terms of the pipeline projects. All we need to do or realize is that people do not live in pipelines. People need actual housing for them to stay in safe spaces. Also, the fact that we are criminalizing occupations and hiding behind a myth of a housing list, because the city of Cape Town constantly speaks to us, activists and Cape Town residents, about a housing list, where actually I don't think that there's a housing list. If there's a housing list, then we'd like to know, where are the occupiers all on the line? How far are they? How many years will it take for them to get a house? If there was a housing list would be one that would actually detail to say you will get your house at this location after this number of years, in 20 years, 15 years, and so on. But without a pragmatic, tangible plan in terms of the housing issue, people find alternatives, because people cannot tolerate homelessness. And we've seen during COVID how brutal, under the leadership of Jordan Lewis, how brutal the law enforcement officers have been towards myself and other activists, including Bulelani Kolani, who was dragged out naked out of his home during a level 5 lockdown in our city, dragged out whilst naked. And so we need to realize that the occupations do come, and informality do come into being as a result of no plan in terms of a tangible plan with timelines and a budget, which actually will detail to say this is when you can expect a housing opportunity for you to get it.
Thank you, Nkosikona. I really appreciate your insights. And I know you've been involved in this fight for a long time. There's a lot of history and a lot of personal history wrapped up in the struggle for affordable housing here in Cape Town. Jordan, I'm going to bring it back to you and give you an opportunity just to respond to some of what Nkosikona brought up in what he was saying about timelines and budgets for affordable housing in the inner city. And maybe you could highlight a couple of the success stories for the city of Cape Town, but also this element of, when we can expect to see real progress on some of the projects that have been, where land has been set aside in the inner city. I'm also going to bring in an audience question for you, and if that's all right to respond to at the same time. We have a question from Nomfundo Molefe, and I think it's quite relevant to something we've been hearing in the media recently, which is, what about international nomads working virtually and taking annual lease in Cape Town as a base, and even subletting to their kinsmen? For example, local professionals competing with Europeans for rental accommodation or housing here in the city. So I think this issue that we've seen people speaking about in the media of a lot of digital nomads and such living, working, and renting here in the city of Cape Town. So if I'll hand over to you, Mayor, for those two issues.
Okay, there's quite a few issues that I must respond to. Firstly, the description of what we are doing to try and get homeless people off of the streets and into care facilities and safe spaces. The use of the word punitive, I'd like to just quibble with the use of that word. I don't think it's punitive at all. When we are trying everything possible to try to intervene in someone's life who's in an incredibly difficult space, who might be suffering with an addiction in many cases, who might be suffering with either diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health issues, or who might just have gone through an incredibly difficult time personally and has ended up on the street in a tent, or sometimes even less than a tent, that we are trying to intervene in that person's life to get them the help that they need, the social worker that they need, the medical care that they need. They are not in the frame of mind to accept that help voluntarily because of where they are in their life. And so we, after lots and lots of engagement and offering and going to meet with them and so on, we go to the court to help to do that. I don't think that's punitive at all. I think what is punitive and what prolongs that person's suffering is when you actually act to keep them on the street and prolong their stay on the street. I think that is punitive and it only exacerbates their suffering. So I thank Nick and Nkosakona for some positive comments. I don't think that Nick and Nkosakona, my impression is not that the city ever opposed social housing. I think what I have learned about social housing is that it's unbelievably complex and difficult to actually get through the system. I don't want to get into all of the technicalities, but there's something called the Municipal Asset Transfer Regulations and a mountain of red tape that is involved in getting a piece of land through the system out to market, especially if you want to discount that land, which is essential if you want to deliver affordable housing. You have to be able to discount it. So what I think has changed, we certainly have ramped up delivery, as both of you have said, and I thank you for that. In fact, I just want to make clear, we've released more parcels of land in the last 2 years than in the 10 years before that. So there has been a dramatic increase. But what really that comes down to, I'm afraid, is not rocket science. It's about focused commitment and leadership on the issue to get those pieces of land through the system. Really looking at each piece of land. Let's take Salt River Market. What exactly is standing in its way right now? How do we remove that obstacle? How do we get it to the next stage in the process? We find a new obstacle. How do we remove that one? Get it to the next stage of the process. I often say that South Africa has got regulation made for the wealthiest Norwegian town that we have to try and apply in a developing world context with enormous poverty and development challenges. These things take unbelievably long, but with focused attention. We meet every 30 days in my office and we go through our land parcels by name, one by one, and we say, right, what is the current obstacle? How do we get rid of it? Move, next one. How do we get rid of that obstacle? And so I do think that there is, there's obviously tangible progress. You can see the land that we've released over the last 2 years, and those then go out to social housing partners, like companies like Diversity and Communicare and SOCO and others. And they start to do those developments and tenant the people as the construction finishes. So there's also a time at which it becomes out of the city's hands. We hand over the subsidy, we hand over the land, we do the discount. And by the way, just a little flag on the discount, we've actually codified for the first time that I'm aware of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, but that I'm aware of the first time in South Africa that we've codified the rules in our council kind of policy documents as to how we will discount the land, all the way down to 0 if necessary, so that we can get the maximum possible social housing benefit. So then on budget and timeline, as I said, once the piece of land is through our pipeline, then we become a partner. Essentially we hold the hand of a development company, a social housing partner that completes that project, and so then it goes through the planning application process, plan approval, and construction. But all of our projects in Nkosakona, we have a detailed budget which is freely available. You can see exactly what housing projects are budgeted this year and every year for the next 3 years. We have a 3-year budget cycle. I see someone asked, by the way, why are you only talking about the next 3 years? It's just because we have a 3-year budget cycle. So, the next year it moves another 3 years and so on. And so you can see detailed budget allocations for every project. And you can go and see where you are on the housing waiting list. Every person who is on the waiting list in Cape Town has the little housing card, which I'm sure you are familiar with. You can go to any housing office in the city, or you can just email the city and check exactly where you are, what project you are allocated to, if there is any project. Of course, let's not beat around the bush. The huge majority of people are still not allocated to a project because there are not enough projects and not enough money in the system to even begin to scratch the surface of those number of people waiting on the list. But that there is an orderly, structured system is I think indisputable. There absolutely is, and you're welcome to see it. But when you undermine that orderly, structured system by supporting illegal occupations, particularly illegal occupations of buildings which are ripe, which are perfectly situated and located, and where all the circumstances are perfect for a massive social housing project, then you really upend that orderly system, and you do inject chaos into the system. And that's why we have to, despite all the excellent work to ramp up and accelerate social housing delivery, we still have to be steadfastly opposed to illegal occupations and defend the rule of law and the orderly allocation system.
Thanks, Jordan. Do you want to comment at all on that issue of
Mfundo's question? Yeah.
Yes,
So there wasn't a specific question there that you asked Mfundo, but I presume you're implying that when digital nomads come to live here, they are taking up a housing opportunity. Now, we're not going to ban essentially wealthy foreign visitors from coming to Cape Town. In fact, we want many more of them because of what they do for our economy. We want Cape Town to be a place where wealthy digital nomads can come and live. But what we want to do is make sure that there is a supply, and a accelerated supply of affordable housing in the market that can supply housing to reasonably supply housing to all of those who are looking for it in the city. We're obviously a long way from that, but that's the idea. So I don't think we must pitch, a digital nomad coming to rent an apartment in Camps Bay or something like that with the supply of affordable housing and social housing that we are trying to relax and foster much more of. Those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Thanks, Jordan. Nick, I'd like to bring you back in to talk a bit about this issue of policy and budget around affordable housing and social housing. And I know Ndifuna Kwazi has done a lot of work, and I see there was a question about what advocacy NGOs are advocacy NGOs engaging the National Department of Human Settlements and that kind of question. And my understanding is that there have been some engagements around policies around social housing that have changed recently and have changed the landscape for what's happening at a city level as well. So if you could maybe speak to some of the issues that you've identified when it comes to policies and budget for these kinds of projects here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, two very brief things. I would push back very strongly against the idea that the housing list is in any way a rational, sequential system for allocating housing. People that are on the list for 1 year can get a home, while people that have been on the list for 35 don't. And that's a cold, hard fact. I'd be glad to engage Jordan another time and demonstrate empirically how it's not a rational, sequential system. Secondly, there's this thing of pitching people on the waiting list against people in occupations. Most people on the waiting list do live in occupations already, because that's the nature of our housing system, unfortunately. That said, I think you ask a very important question, because while the city does have a large responsibility for housing delivery here, because it applied for and got accredited, national government has a huge role to play. And actually what we're seeing is that they are becoming a major, major, major barrier to some of the progress that's been secured in Cape Town. So firstly, just to say, social housing is rental housing for households that earn between 1,850 and 22,000 Rand a month. Unlike all other government housing programs, it can only be built in well-located areas, and it's the only housing program that targets integration, that targets desegregation, and that targets the reversal of spatial apartheid. All of that said, other housing delivery sort of BNG and RDP houses has generally been very peripheral, which has often trapped people in poverty because it limits their access to well-located areas and all of the various benefits that they provide. I think that we advocate for social housing, but like I said, because it's the only program that targets well-located areas. And also because, an individual social housing apartment can benefit multiple families over time. And I really do think it's necessary, both from the perspective of justice and decency, but also from the perspective of economic productivity. The sort of dysfunctional spatial form where people live so far from jobs is a big, hindering factor to our economic growth. But basically, there's been this incredibly long battle spanning decades to get the social housing program up and running. And there's been this diverse group of people have spent well over a decade kind of convincing the city to pursue social housing and release land for this purpose. And we now have this impressive pipeline of land available and this genuine political will to drive it forward. But what's ultimately happening is that chaos within the National Department of Human Settlements is really kind of hindering what the city can actually do. So, just to emphasize how badly delivery is crashing, there's only one project getting funding approval for Cape Town in the last financial year, and only about 2,000 or 3,000 social housing apartments being approved with funding across the entire country. Social housing only gets 2.9% of the overall housing budget. And when you consider that the government is seemingly incapable of spending so many other forms of housing grants with so much money returned to the Treasury each year, it makes absolutely no sense that we now have dozens of projects in Cape Town and across the country that are blocked because there's no money sort of directed towards them. And what makes matters a hell of a lot worse, actually, is that national government is increasingly approving peripheral projects that don't actually meet the core aims of social housing, which means that this very scarce and limited pot of resources gets wasted on projects that don't actually help to spatially restructure our cities. So already there's a disproportionately small amount of social housing in Cape Town. There's 3 times the amount in Johannesburg, despite the fact that Johannesburg has a much higher sort of market-driven supply of affordable housing. And what it feels like is that no matter how many political pronouncements are made, no matter how many policies are developed, no matter how many big national laws are passed, it appears that there's very little commitment at a national level to really address the legacy of spatial apartheid and use the only mechanism that actually exists to do so. So, I understand when Jordan says that social housing is complicated. I think that's not a good excuse for the lack of progress previously, because as we've seen under Jordan's term, there has been this big jump in progress. That would have been possible before, in my opinion, 100%. So really what I want to do is just urge national government to properly fund and support this program so that dozens of projects across the country can be unblocked and provide much, much needed affordable housing in areas from which people were evicted. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Nkosikazi, I'm going to turn over to you, because I think as much as we have this question of what government needs to be doing at the different levels to address this issue of people living without homes, people occupying space, people being left without affordable housing, there's also a question of what other sections of society need to be doing. Obviously, civil society is a part of that, but also business and private individuals. And I'm sure there's a lot of people watching this webinar today who would be interested in knowing what they could do to tackle issues of homelessness and housing in their own spaces. So maybe if you could give us an idea of what you think is needed in those different non-state spaces to move this conversation forward.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. I think maybe let me start here. I think maybe just wrapping up the point around homelessness and the issues that we then observe there. I think the approach that Jordan Lewis has taken around his commitments towards social housing and his commitments around ensuring that there are homeless shelters available for people who are homeless, it's one that we can never not acknowledge. However, the approach that should not be contradicting, or the city council in terms of other departments should not be contradicting those commitments. For instance, we're seeing the rise of JP Smith with his law enforcement people policing homeless people. And we're seeing laws that are aiming to criminalize homeless people. Arresting someone who's homeless, they are homeless because they don't have money. Finding them, how are they supposed to get that money? And there are so many complexities with the homelessness issue. It's informed by, a lot of departments need to be brought in, right? It's got to do with correctional services. What happens when someone is released from jail and they have nowhere to go? So the city also has a role to play in ensuring what Nick spoke to, sustainable long-term solutions in terms of housing for the homeless community. Social services, there are issues that affects people socially in where they stay that leads them into homelessness. There are issues of mental health, there are issues of gender-based violence, issues of human trafficking. This is a very complicated and complex matter. It doesn't just require what the housing department was doing. There's a particular reason why South Africa moved from Department of Housing to the Department of Human Settlements, because the housing issue cannot be addressed only by building brick and mortar houses. You need to look into the surroundings of a particular home. Where people live matters. And it's what Ndifuna Ukwazi and Reclaim the City have been saying, that it's not enough to be building homeless shelters only, because also in those shelters, there are issues in terms of how families are catered for. And I'll tell you now, as a matter of fact, that if a family goes into a homeless shelter, they will be separated. There's no way to accommodate a family. There's no way to accommodate families that come into these homeless shelters. And that's replicating what apartheid did to many families. And what we need there, Tamsin, is not only the building of these shelters, but we need to be building safe spaces that are actually centered around addressing trauma. Because all of these things that I've mentioned, at the core of them, homelessness is informed by traumas that people endure in different aspects of their lives. And we must look into how we then run programs within these homeless shelters for people to be rehabilitated. And that's a process. It can't be just be a bed and then it ends there. There needs to be more. Social services have to be brought in. There needs to be a hiring of more social workers, not law enforcement officers. We need more social workers to fix the social fabric of South Africa and Cape Town. Our communities are torn apart as a result of many traumas, systemic as well as traumas that are socially in our spaces. And that is one of the approaches that we basically need to see in our communities, and not only building housing or just building homeless shelters. There's many things that builds to it, that builds to that.
If I could just bring that, sorry,
it's just factually incorrect that we don't cater for couples. We do cater for couples in our safe spaces. And all of our safe spaces are exactly that. They are a holistic social support and development suite of care rather than just a roof over the head. Of course, that's the most important starting point, a dignified place to sleep and wash. But they have got social workers. Each person gets a personal development plan. They get training. They get job readiness assistance. They get help getting an ID book. They get help getting a driver's license if they need it. They get referral to mental health treatment, referral for drug addiction treatment or alcohol addiction treatment, all starting at the safe space. So literally everything that Nkosi Corner has asked for is exactly what we are doing.
100%.
Between Ria Tusana, which is an organization particularly focusing on homelessness in the Muizenberg area, as well as some parts of the inner city, is needed. And for them to perhaps take you to some of these homeless shelters where there are these issues that they've highlighted. And I've also personally witnessed them because I've been to some of these shelters.
I'm going to bring that in now. Just one moment. I'll ask Jordan, because I think they asked some questions about rules and conditions at the shelter coming from the audience as well. But in Nkosi Corner, before you wrap completely, could you just comment as well on that issue of what your layman can do in the community? You know, what people watching this webinar could do, what private individuals, businesses should be doing to really contribute to this homelessness and housing discussion as well.
I think the first one is perhaps for the City Council, Mayor Jordan Lewis, to consider aligning the pipeline plans into budgets, so that those plans, we know that all the pieces of land that have been pronounced on, they have a budget, and there's a timeline in terms of when we will see actually the actual building of that. The second is what sort of Nick and other researchers in the city of Cape Town in South Africa have worked on, an inclusionary housing policy, which is a policy that aims to bring the private sector into the conversation around addressing the issue of housing in this city. And cities like Joburg have already gotten the policy in place. And what we need here in Cape Town is perhaps to make the private sector to realize that they also have an obligation. And that's a global phenomenon of the private sector, in terms of if you look at Sao Paulo, Manhattan, and other big cities, where if you buy a piece of land from the state, a portion of it is designated for affordable housing at the expense of the developer. What we have seen in Cape Town is that public land is being sold to the private sector. In some instances, Mr. Jordan Lewis, you are giving, and your city are giving discounts to big private developers, such as Growth Point. The Site B site, where Growth Point bought that piece of land, they got a massive discount of about 240 million. Nick can speak to that point in terms of the bulk space going up. And we are saying that when the city sells land, we are not in agreement that public land must be sold in the middle of a housing crisis. We are of the view that public land must be used for public good and to address these public issues that we are confronted with, such as homelessness, as well as the issue of land and housing scarcity in the city of Cape Town, particularly for Black and brown people. And those are people who have suffered in terms of losing land and housing in the hands of the deep and dark, violent history we have through apartheid and colonialism. And we're saying that there are laws in place, there are policies in place. All we need, the states that we're in, requires no promises, but an action. We want to see land being used for affordable housing, but in the case where the city sells the land, it must be sold at a price, at a market value, also including an obligation of the private sector to also contribute in building social affordable housing.
I'm going to cut you off there. I'm sorry, we've got limited time left, and I do want to get to some other issues we have on the docket. But Jordan, I'm going to hand back over to you. And I think first there's this conditions in shelter question that I'd like to give you a bit more time on. I see we've got two questions from listeners. One from M. Engelbrecht saying, why only 3 months allowed in a shelter? It's not long enough for people to get on their feet. And I'm sure you'll have something to say about the times that are available in shelters run by the city. And the other from Iman Musa saying, why are only 2.5% of people who go into shelters rehabilitated into society? So if you could maybe spend a bit of time just addressing, what kind of conditions in the shelter, in terms of time, in terms of quality of rehabilitative program, is the city striving for, and is there room for improvement in that regard?
I'm aware we've got 12 minutes and I just see hundreds of questions, which I'm very grateful for. And maybe we must just have a follow-up session where we just answer people's questions, because I'm happy to answer all these questions. But let me just say there's no 3-month limit on the shelter. I'm not sure. There's lots of misinformation that goes around about our shelter system. So maybe at one of the private church shelters or one of the other NGO shelters, there's a 3-month limit, but not at our shelters. As I think I really agree with Nkosi Corner's description of the unbelievable complexity of what drives homelessness. It is a multivariate problem. It includes domestic violence, drug addiction, mental health, poverty, the collapse and breakdown of family units, and much more besides that I'm not even mentioning. So it's really tough to actually get people to successfully pass through the course and become independent, live independently again. But we keep going. They keep meeting with their social worker, and we do have some success. Of course, I would like more success. And where we see much greater success, for example, organizations like U-Turn and MES or MES and Streetscapes, they are showing and others as well that I'm not mentioning. I don't want to single them out, but they are showing tremendous success rates, much higher success rates, but in much smaller numbers. They work with 80 or 100 people at a time. We're working with thousands of people. So that's why we put a lot more money that I haven't even spoken about tonight. We put a lot more money into supporting those organizations as well, because they actually show in that focus model, they show better success. I quickly want to talk about the inclusionary housing policy. Look, I assume all of us agree that we want a greater supply of affordable housing. That is the outcome that we are trying to target. My great fear is that you might get less supply of affordable housing if you just tax developers more. And so we are going to take our time to develop an inclusionary housing policy that actually achieves the outcome. It would be the easiest thing for me to do in Kosikona to pass a policy which just includes an additional tax for developers that says you must develop and you must include this additional cost, and for developers just to move elsewhere. They'll develop in Paarl, they'll develop at Val de Vie, they'll develop in Stellenbosch, they'll develop in Franschhoek, they'll develop in Malmesbury, they might even develop outside of the Western Cape if those property markets improve. But they have choices. They're not forced. So the worst of all worlds is if we actually have a well-intentioned, well-meaning policy, but get a worse outcome. We get less affordable housing, not more. And I really think that there's evidence for that happening in some of those other cities that you've mentioned. People often mention New York City as an example of where this mandatory affordable. New York City is the most expensive place to live in the world. Literally, the most expensive place in the world is Manhattan. So I don't think that should be used as an example of where you can increase the supply of affordable housing. So what Johannesburg did is just make these micro units. They just stipulated these tiny little units, 20 square meters or less, 17 square meters, 14 square meters even. And so that keeps the price very low. So again, they've just taken a blunt instrument approach. And there's some merit to that because it cuts out a lot of complexity, of course, but it doesn't get you what you really want, again, which is units that families can actually live in. A single guy or a single lady might be able to live in a 17 square meter unit, but you can't start a family there. So we're gonna make sure that we get a policy that actually achieves the outcome. And I feel comfortable that that's a much better thing to do than to just rush to market with a policy that then actually makes the problem worse over time, not better. And then lastly, I know we've got 9 minutes, but let me just say, Nkosi says that land must be sold at market value. Where land is being developed for private purposes, of course, it must be sold at full market value. But we are actually arguing that land must be discounted for social housing and affordable housing. I'm more than willing. It's not about raising revenue for the city. That's not our primary concern. Our primary concern is to get more affordable housing. So if we can discount a piece of land and increase the yield of affordable housing, I'm much rather going to do that. And that's why we've codified those rules. Thank you. That was a mouthful.
Thank you, Jordan. We are limited for time, but Nick, I'd still like to ask you, I know Jordan brought up New York as an example of a city and what kind of things are happening there. As a researcher, what are some of the other countries, other contexts we can learn from that maybe have a more similar socioeconomic background to the one we do when it comes to solutions for social housing, solutions for homelessness?
Absolutely. I mean, firstly, I just want to say that inclusionary housing isn't a tax, and as long as that it's accompanied with a very clever set of incentives, it can actually really benefit both developers and people that need housing. But I'm going to do your question the other way around. I'm going to start with the challenges and then move on to the kind of learnings. So there are many factors that make the housing challenge very complex here. Of course, we had 350 years of very direct, intentional state action to build a housing system that benefits the white minority at the expense of the black and colored minority. And we're going to need similarly intense and direct state intervention if we're ever going to overcome that. Of course, inequality and unemployment are major factors in developing countries because people just don't have much money to spend on housing costs. I think government capacity and institutional inability is a major, major barrier. The state at a national level delivers 5 times less service sites today than it did in the mid-2000s and 7 times less brick and mortar homes than it did in the late 90s. So of course there have been cuts to the housing budget recently, but the sort of spectacular collapse in government delivery happened long, long before those housing budget cuts came in, which shows us that actually it's also very much a question of institutional capacity and ability. And that's hindered when we have many human settlements entities that have leadership structures that are staffed by people that have no qualifications, experience, or expertise in housing at all. All of that said, funding is, of course, a major constraint, as I explained in my previous input. And that's often the case in many other developing countries. And then finally, a constraint that's specific to Cape Town is that there's this extreme compliance culture in the city. So the city is obsessed with clean audits, both because they show that people get value for their money and that money isn't being wasted like it is in so many of our other dysfunctional municipalities. But what it does is that compliance gets placed above everything else, so that officials are really scared to experiment or innovate, because if something goes wrong, they get the book thrown at them and they're the ones that pay the price. So I think a big cultural shift is kind of required there. And then I know I'm running out of time, I'll be as quick as I can. But in terms of the interventions to address our housing crisis and lessons that we can get from elsewhere, I would need another 3 hours to fully unpack this. But I think South America is particularly instructive, countries like Brazil and Colombia, where huge amounts of effort and energy have been dedicated towards helping people to build and improve their houses and neighborhoods themselves. And that all starts with the foundation of tenure security. You give people tenure security where they currently live, you regularize occupations, and you help people to incrementally build homes over time. We've seen a real recognition in policy, at least, that that's something we need to do. But unfortunately, there's been no associated rearrangement of the funding or institutional mechanisms of delivery. And that makes me seriously, seriously worried about the direction that we're heading in. Similarly, I think, of course, the state, that said, I'm not saying that the state must withdraw from its role in housing provision. I think it's very important that it provides housing, and one of the best tools to do so is by mobilizing public land. Public land is an incredibly powerful tool for reshaping housing outcomes. And instead of being sort of sold off for revenue generation or whatever, we can use it in creative ways, leverage in private money, leverage in public money, and build as much affordable housing on public land as we possibly can. We've seen these recent announcements and this recent progress, and a number of really significant reforms in the city in the last few years. But we also have to remain cautious. We've been burnt before. We've seen many projects announced. Many of the projects that are announced now were first announced in 2008 and 2003. So as land and housing activists, we have to remain cautious and we have to keep the pressure up, because I genuinely believe that pushes the city in the right direction, and that leads to outcomes that actually are better for all of us from every perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. I know we are tight for time. We're going to go a tiny bit over 7. I apologize to anyone watching who needs to run, but I just want to give a final thing for everyone to wrap up. 1 minute each, given the time constraints we're under, but just bringing it back to this human question, because I think that's so important when we're talking about issues of homelessness and housing, is that it can't just be about numbers and stats. It really has to be about bringing these voices into the conversation as well, from communities that are living unhoused, that are living in housing insecure situations. So representing your different sides, politics, research, activism, how do you bring those stories and those voices into what you do, and not just talk about them, but actually engage with them? We'll start with you, Jordan.
Well, thank you for the engagement. It's been great, and I'm very happy. There's been so many interesting questions which I'd love to answer, but we'd need another 3 hours for that. But I'm happy to arrange such a session. What I've tried to do over the last 2 years is really simple: reorient the city's homelessness strategy around care interventions and anchored in our safe spaces. And we're going to carry on doing that until we can really provide care for all of those living on the streets who need it, and importantly, restore public spaces so that we don't get the sense of urban decay that we see in many other cities in our country, and which we cannot possibly allow to happen or take root in Cape Town. Secondly, to try and increase the supply of affordable housing and work on the supply side of the equation. And I really think that we are making progress. I totally agree with what was said about trust. We've got to deliver, and it's a big part of my day to make sure that we do that. And then simply to say that it's been a good engagement. We'll carry on with our delivery program, and I'm happy to engage further and answer a lot more of these questions. And importantly, while we increase on the supply side, we also cannot support lawlessness on the demand side. And that is very, very important. And I leave that thought with you.
Thanks, Jordan. Kosikona, I'm going to hand over to you on that final wrap-up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are examples in many parts of the world, particularly in Brazil, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and some parts of Mexico. I mean, other big cities where occupations are actually not being criminalized. And I think Mayor Jordan Lewis is missing a point here. Instead of criminalizing the occupiers that have occupied the vacant buildings in the inner city of Cape Town, there's an opportunity to engage with those occupiers. The city of Cape Town during Mayor Dan Plato's time actually opened up an opportunity, particularly for the Sisikool House, which is in the old Woodstock Hospital, to engage on a possibility of expanding that accommodation and formalizing housing there, instead of rendering thousands of people who were evicted into homelessness again into homelessness. The second part, I just want to ask Mayor Jordan Lewis to support the Tafelberg case, because the Tafelberg case aims to do part of your obligations of building housing in the inner city of Cape Town and undoing the legacy of apartheid. We have not heard of the city in terms of what the position the city holds with regards to that case, but it would be great if you can make a pronouncement in terms of where you stand as the mayor, current mayor of the city of Cape Town. Do you support that there should be housing built on Tafelberg, or you are like your comrade, Alan Windy, who has spent millions of rands of public money that could have been used to build housing, just to oppose and to prove a point that, housing will not be built in the formerly white areas, particularly in Sea Point? Where does the city stand in terms of Tafelberg? Are you in support, or like the provincial government, you're against the Tafelberg case? On the 30th of August, we've invited you to come and watch Mother City with us. Some of the things you're raising on this platform are addressed in that documentary. There's many voices there, including your voice there, and would love for you to come and see the documentary that you are featured on.
Thanks so much, Nkosikwana. Nick, if I could hand over to you just for that 1-minute wrap on including those voices.
Sure. I mean, I think I stay connected to people affected by this crisis because I interact with them every single day in my work. Ndifuna Ukwazi runs a housing clinic where people come every single day of the week to get advice and assistance on a range of housing related issues. And we work with social movements filled with the most brilliant, dedicated, hardworking, committed, caring people who are fighting this fight. Many of those, and that to me is what really hurts, when this idea of criminalizing occupiers and painting them with one brush, is that some of the most brilliant people I've ever met or ever had the privilege of meeting in my life live in occupations on the outskirts of the city, in inner city buildings all over the place. So I think when you interact with people like that on a daily basis and you build relationships and you share in this fight together, that gives a lot of motivation and a lot of passion to drive this forward, because people are let down over and over again by circumstances far beyond their control. And actually, I believe that things can and must get better, and that's worth fighting for, and that if we fight together, we're very powerful. So that's how I try to stay connected in that sense.
Thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more in terms of fighting together and staying connected with those people in those spaces. We're going to wrap up now. Thank you so much to all our speakers for being here today. It's been an incredible conversation, and I feel like I've learned so much. I hope that everyone listening has as well. Jordan, I'll definitely be taking you up on that offer of a follow-up session, because I think there are so many incredible questions that I wish we had time to delve deeper on now, but we are unfortunately over time. So we're going to say good evening, good night, and thank you again to all. Till next time.
Thank you very much.